As people, intellectuals, and activists do, we share things with each other. And I've been to Regina a couple of times, and so I really, I think very highly. I think that Mark's work in higher education is really terrific stuff, leading edge stuff, and so I'm very happy to, anytime I have a chance to interact with him or support what he's doing, that's great. And I'm very happy to be with you tonight, talking about issues of inequality and globalization, and basically what the hell is happening to this world. The spin I want to put on it, there's 1,000 people who could give you a really good talk about inequality and international development, and probably half of you could do the same thing as well. But what I want to do is I want to put the spin on it. I want to put a knowledge spin, or it'd be a more academic word, epistemological spin. I want to talk about the relationship between knowledge and inequality in the world that we're living in today. So myself, Rajesh, and I, in our work in with our UNESCO chair, we work with this concept of knowledge democracy. So I want to talk a little bit about knowledge democracy, decolonization, and epistemicide within the context of, global, what's going on in the world. Does that make sense to you guys?
Sounds great.
Okay. Okay, so let's see if this is going to work. Okay. It's supposed to go. It's supposed to move. Oh, here it is. There we go. All right, so this is what I'm going to talk about in more detail. I'm going to talk a little bit about global distribution and production of knowledge. I'm going to talk a little bit about topology of knowledge systems. I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of epistemicide, which is epistemicide is the killing off of knowledge systems, which happened in our context here in Canada when settler colonialism came and erased or attempted to erase indigenous knowledge, but it's a phenomena all over the world. Wherever European knowledge carriers have gone over the last 500 years, they've participated in the erasure of other knowledge systems. I want to talk about knowledge and dispossession, and a little bit about how did we get, so why is it that we've got such a dominance now of this kind of Eurocentric knowledge, stuff? How did we end up like this? And then I'll finish up with some more things about knowledge democracy. The centrality of knowledge, there's been a number of knowledge discourses that all of you will have heard about. Peter Drucker, came up with this idea of knowledge economy quite a few years ago, and it's been picked up mostly by governments, and certainly by the market, and where they say that the world is now is no longer it's not about land, it's not about owning the means of production. It's about it's about knowledge, and it's who controls knowledge, who owns knowledge, and that's now you'll see language in our strategic vision about that we have to have really good skills in Canada if we're going to compete in the global marketplace. And so that's a discourse, a knowledge discourse, which we're very familiar with, but it's not a very progressive. It doesn't give us any, there's no room in there for much talk about agency. So out of the critique of knowledge economy came the concept of knowledge society. And these two people, Sorlin and Vessuri, done a very nice study for UNESCO on knowledge society. And what they talk about is, they talk about knowledge not just as a economic as a as a part of the fabric of the economy. But they said that knowledge should be understood and used in order to strengthen citizenship and participation. And that's a discourse which which is certainly much better than the knowledge economy discourse. But the limitation of it is that it does not question whose knowledge. The assumption is that the Western canon, or the Eurocentric body of knowledge, which has been around for about 500 years or so, that's the knowledge, and there's no questioning about what's missing from that knowledge picture, nor what other knowledge it might be. So furthering the sort of the critique, or looking for a different way to talk about knowledge. Rajesh and myself and people like Boaventura and Sosa Santos and quite a few other people now have drifted in towards this discussion of what we call knowledge democracy. And within knowledge democracy, which I'll come back to, we talk about multiplicity of knowledges, an ecology of knowledges, and a number of things. So I'll come back to that. But I want to preface it is that knowledge and our understanding of what it is has a great deal to do with the situation of inequality that we face in the world these days. Now, if you take a look at this, I don't know how big it shows up in the room or on your screen, but whoops, it disappeared. But if you take a look at and we're moving now into the question of the distribution, unequal distribution of knowledge. If you take a look at this list, these are the top 25 most quoted authors in Google Scholar. And take a look. Can you see? Is it big enough to see the names of the authors?
Yeah.
So you see, if you read down, what can you tell me when you look down that list of authors? What occurs to you?
What do you see, folks?
Shows up.
White man.
Yeah. Yeah, they're white. They're white men, almost all of them, and there's only 2 women in the whole list, and there's not a single, of course, indigenous person there. There may be. Let me see. I don't think there's a person. There's no no person of color there. The only person from what we'd call the global South, outside Europe and North America, is Paulo Freire, which is great, but all of the rest are are people from our. So this is this is 2000, and this particular list was 2018. I don't think it's changed very much. These are the kinds of books, and maybe there's 200 or 300 more of these books, which are foundational texts in higher education. And these will be read all over the world. If we go to a university in India, we go to a university in Colombia, if we go to a university in Mexico, and of course the European and Australia and so forth and so on, you're going to find most of these people will be there. There's a nearly total domination of this kind of Eurocentric knowledge system that's there. Now this is another attempt to illustrate the unequal production of knowledge. I think I should call this unequal production and distribution of knowledge, because I actually don't believe. I believe that there's a lot of knowledge that's created that just never goes anywhere. So it's not really that they're not producing knowledge, but anyway, this is the way I labeled it at the time. Now the map, you can draw maps according to the territory that they use, or wealth that they have, or water resources. You can use any kind of scale you want to draw a map. This map of the world is drawn according to academic knowledge production. So that means books, it means websites, it means journal articles, and so forth. And so the larger the country, the more production, knowledge products it has. So you can see that big blue thing on the left, on my left, which is the US, and then that sort of a dark blue on top. That's us in Canada, and a slightly thin little blue line below, which is Mexico, and that whole thing underneath looks like a kind of a grasshopper or something strange, or a bird or something. That's Latin America, the whole of Latin America, but it's made so small because in terms of production of knowledge. If you go over to the, does that cursor show up, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you see where my cursor is, that's actually England. And when you think how small England is, how in the world, but it's because it's producing so much knowledge. And you can see, Europe, look how big Europe is. And all of this down here, which is a very big continent. Which continent is that one?
Africa.
We're
Africa.
all sending Africa.
Africa.
Africa, you're right, that's Africa. And when you think how much bigger Africa is than Europe, it's just amazing. So anyway, I won't go into it in more detail, but this gives you the combination of that previous chart, and this is the situation that we are, that we're living in. And so in terms of inequality, we know about GDP, we know about different carbon uses. We know all kinds of inequalities, but the inequality in knowledge distribution and production is one that we don't talk about as much. And my point is, and a number of us, we think it's that the knowledge, the knowledge and this notion of whose knowledge counts contributes enormously to questions of inequality in the world. These are articles. Basically, the darker the country, the more articles per million people. And you can see, again, same pattern. You've got North America is very dark, Europe's very dark, Australia, Africa, almost nothing. It's all down here, 0.3%. So, it's the same kind of a system. These are domains. These are, like a website, names and all of that. Again, it repeats the same pattern that you see over as a domination of knowledge capture, in the same parts of the world. And this is another bar chart, content creation across continents. The Europe and the blue and green are Europe and North America. And academic articles, Europe is ahead of North America. Collaborative coding, which is working together on on software design and so forth. Europe and North America are about the same. And domain registrations, Europe is a little bit ahead, but look down at the bottom. The yellow one is Africa, the red one is the Middle East. What's going on? I want to talk a little bit about, since my internet connection is unstable, I think I take that as an insult. I don't think I'm unstable.
It was a wrong
The question is, so how do we get into this situation? What's going on here? Some of you will have heard about David Harvey. David Harvey is a Marxist geographer. He's probably one of the most quoted Marxist scholars in the world today. He's a British geographer, Marxist, and he's the fellow who has has told us that the beginning of capital accumulation was associated with the dispossession of land, people's dispossession of land. And we certainly have that story here in Canada. The colonial settler process has been a steady, dispossession of indigenous land from the very first contact and continuing on until today. But how does that relate to knowledge? So one of the things that happened in the 15th century in the UK and at different times in other parts of the world, up until the 15th century, land was used, even in England, was used in common. In other words, if you had cattle or goats or sheep or whatever, you'd work it out where you'd all have a little bit of pasture land and you'd share. You might have arguments about whose sheep and whose cattle over there, but basically, it was a sharing kind of environment. What some clever people discovered is that if you could enclose some of the commons, either through actually a wall or through force, through soldiers or guards, in order to keep your cattle or your goats or your workers inside and other people's outside. If you could take control of that land, then you could actually begin to accumulate, a surplus, a capital surplus, because you could control, all of the profits that came from from that land, came to the person who had control of the land. So that's known as the enclosures, and some of you will have studied that in European history. Now, one of the things that you might not be aware of is that around the same time as the enclosures were being created, the medieval universities in different parts of the world. So this is a college, it's shot as a college from one of the colleges in Oxford. Oxford, Cambridge, a number of the Italian universities. These are medieval. These were started in the 15th century, 14th century, and one of the things that caused me to think when I was visiting this particular college a few years ago is that before, just like the land was used in common, so knowledge prior in those days when land was all, the knowledge was also floating around freely. So knowledge wasn't it might be specialized, but it was distributed throughout a given land, so that there would be people who would become known as better able to look after animals. There would be people who would become better known for their knowledge of medicines. There would be people who had better knowledge around buildings, and so forth and so on. And so knowledge was something that was basically loose in society, and you'd go around and find it. It wasn't treated in an elite form. So what happened with the creation of the medieval university is that walls, just like the enclosure, closed off the use of land to the person who could, through military might, control the land. So these medieval colleges that all grew up with walls, they enclosed knowledge. And so that after the creation of these kinds of colleges, the world suddenly began to move into a situation where some people are knowers, those people that were sitting around inside these colleges talking and, you know, getting, and those people outside were not knowers. So you have a process of you know, kind of an elitism, a control, and so people with knowledge who were known as knowledge keepers were dispossessed of the uniqueness of their knowledge, and their knowledge was you know, over time they attempted to improve on, you know, on community-based knowledge through science. And so you have the rise of science. Now, when the colleges and universities were created, at first they were created in order to provide people who would serve the church, and because the church was the most important and source of power, institutionalized power. But of course, over time, the state you know, replaced the church, but the walls remained, and the disciplines, what we call, you know, the disciplinary structure of knowledge, over time, from the 14th and 15th century, has continued to grow and grow and grow and grow, so that today we have in universities we don't actually need a wall, you know, at the University of Victoria or the University of Regina, because by now everybody knows that only academics know, and people who are not academics, they don't really have, you know, they don't know, they don't have the same kind of access to knowledge. Does that make sense? I mean, what I'm saying, I don't know if you agree with it, but you understand the argument that I'm making?
For sure.
Okay. So we've got so this is where some of these concepts come in. The epistemicide by this guy called Boaventura de Sousa Santos has made popular. He's not the only person to use that, but so it's the killing of epistemologies or systems of knowing by the imposition of Western knowledge systems. Now, so here's the situation. We have land dispossession, which, as we know, has continued on. It's a pattern of capital accumulation all over the world. We have knowledge dispossession, but how is it that the particular kind of knowledge, which we call Western knowledge, Western scientific knowledge, how did Western scientific knowledge end up, you know, in such a dominant position, so that, you know, any of us could show up at virtually any university anywhere around the world, and we would find so many of the same authors. We would find, you know, sociology departments. We would find engineering departments. You know, the university structure would look very, very similar. So a fellow called Dussarel, who's a Argentinian scholar, has written about what he calls the four epistemicides of the late 16th century. So up until then, people have understood a lot of the big history stories of the 16th century, you know, in kind of separate pieces, and not in relationship to knowledge, but in relationship to political power, and Dussarel talks about the four epistemicides, and the four epistemicides are, let's see if I can get them in the right order. Conquistadores, slavery, and women. So he says that these are related. That political people, people interested in power, began to understand that the control of knowledge was actually as important as the control, as military control, as the control of violence. And the four instances that he speaks of are, first of all, the destruction of the knowledge system in the Iberian Peninsula. As all of you would know, in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, people of Arabic-speaking people had moved into the Iberian Peninsula, into what is today Spain and Portugal, and established cities, established universities, established libraries, and so forth in that part. So in the 16th century, motivated by kind of a search, an effort to superimpose, to take over that part of the world, the Christian-based people in Spain, other parts of Europe, ganged up on the on the Arabic-speaking part of the Iberian Peninsula, what used to be called Al-Andalus, and basically pushed them out, pushed them back to North Africa. And one of the things that they did, they didn't just, they kept, by the way, they kept a lot of their beautiful buildings. They just took, they just put church, crosses on the top of the minarets that were for Islamic prayer, and turned them into churches. They kept a lot of the architecture, but for example, the libraries, the big libraries in the Spanish part of Al-Andalus, they had hundreds of thousands of 100,000 books in the Cordova library, and the Spaniards burnt the whole library right to the ground, and they did so because they knew that if that knowledge was a source of power for those Arabic-speaking intellectuals, and they wanted to destroy that power. So it wasn't enough to chase people away. They also wanted to destroy the knowledge. And to give you some comparison, that the largest library in the Christian world, which was in a monastery in Italy in those days, would have had about 10,000 books. So the 10,000 books, that was the whole kind of like the equivalent of the encyclopedia of knowledge of Christian Europe. 10,000 books, the Cordova library, and the other big libraries, Alhambra, and so forth, nearly 100,000 books. So that's one. So that's what we would call an epistemicide. Now, second epistemicide, also stemming from that same part of the world, and it extended in later years up into Canada, was the conquest by the Spanish of the indigenous knowledge systems of Latin America, the Aztec, the Inca, and the peoples of Central America. The Spanish moved in. They discovered gold, which they carted off, gold and silver as much as they could. But what I hadn't realized until a few years ago when I started reading this stuff is that they also they made a point of destroying the Inca. Inca people didn't have a written alphabet, but they did have a series of wheels, big stone carvings, where in symbolic letters, the knowledge was the key concepts of the Inca, life, spirituality, way of organizing, was all carved into these stones. They're called codices, or a codex. One of the wheels would be a codex, the whole bunch of them. And the Spaniards destroyed those. And they destroyed the same type of knowledge you know, recording, material recording devices, in the Aztec world. So the point I'm making is that the military force is one part of the, of this system of oppression, but very consciously was this idea that destroying the knowledge is as important as physically occupying, because if you can destroy the knowledge, then people become, discouraged and lacking in confidence and so forth. So a third phenomena from the 16th century, this is when slavery really got started. Slavery, in order to be able to take people, human beings, and to take them and put them to work without any compensation, and take them from their homes and carry them off to other parts of the world, to Latin America, to the Caribbean, to the United States, and some to Europe and so forth. They had to create this fantasy that Africans weren't fully human, that they didn't have the same knowledge making capacities as Europeans. Europeans not only were they white, but they also had superior brains, and anthropologically Africans just weren't really fully human in the way Europeans were, and so that and many, I mean, this is generally held knowledge by everybody, ordinary people. They actually believe that, that enabled a slave trade to develop, because up until really the 19th century, when people started to question that, people thought, well, these aren't really fully human people in any case. Another interesting phenomena, which I've just read about recently, is that there's a relationship, in fact, between the slave trade and the development of Western science. And what is that? Well, you may not have heard about this either, but in those days, when the slave ships were going to all of these places in Africa that no Europeans had ever been, almost always they had a biologist or a botanist or some kind of a Western scientist that was on those ships, and so they would travel on the ship, not somehow not being bothered by the trade itself, because it enabled them to travel to all these places and to gather plant and animal samples, and in other words, to build up, to contribute to the Western body of knowledge. So Western knowledge actually has benefited very directly, not just indirectly, very directly from the slave trade. Now, the last epistemicide of the late 16th century has to do with women's knowledge. Women, this is the period when, particularly, and it goes all the way from India all the way over to, Eastern Europe and into Western Europe. Women as over time, were the people who had most of the knowledge about the medicines and about health and all of that. The women's knowledge started to make a lot of the powerful nervous, and it made them so nervous that this is when the period when a lot of women were accused of being witches, because the kinds of things that they could do that the men could not explain, the men said, "Oh, that's got to be witchcraft," and so the punishment for witchcraft is death, and this whole period of people being burned at the stake, was really on an upswing in the late 16th century. So the combination, we have, I think, I don't know, at least myself, I always had this idea that somehow, Western knowledge developed, science, and it was just better. The reason why it's spread around the world is, it explains, what's going on in the world in a better way. So in a way, it's been a kind of neutral, harmless, it's been a positive contribution to the development of the world. But when you study, world development through a knowledge lens, through an epistemological lens, what you realize is that there's been very intentional, destruction of knowledge systems, leaving, the Western, scientific, often Christian, kind of idea about knowledge, to take the upper hand. This is a quote which I think you guys can. I think you can have. I think Mark's got copies of this, so you can have this. This is I love this. The understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. There can be no global social justice without global epistemic justice. So that's the argument that's being made by people like Rajesh, myself, De Sousa Santos, is that of course there are things that you can do, economic things one can do. There's lots of things to be done in the world, but until we attend to the question of whose knowledge counts, we're really not going to be able to get to the kind of world that we really we really would like to do. So this is where we come to the question of what we call knowledge democracy. So what is knowledge democracy anyway? Knowledge democracy is a number of factors, but first of all, it's a recognition of multiple epistemologies, and you're very familiar at the University of Regina, as we are in other parts of Western Canada, with all of the the really important efforts that are being made to recover and lend visibility to various indigenous ways of seeing the world. And in spite of all of the years of destruction, there's a lot of very good work, and that's because we are recognizing that there are more ways to understand the world than just the Western way. But there's another way to think about multiple epistemologies, and that's in a way that this concept of, sometimes you hear people talking about standpoint epistemology. In other words, the world looks different depending on who you are. So standpoint epistemology, for example, means that if you're a woman, there are aspects of knowledge, how you interact with knowledge, they're different, than other people. If you're trans, you've got a very different idea about the fluidity, of gender, binaries. If you are differently abled, you have a privileged knowledge of aspects of ability that people who are normally have normal attributes that don't experience. So when we think about multiple epistemologies, of course, indigenous, the whole knowledge systems is that, but there's also the epistemology of exclusion in general. A second principle of knowledge democracy is that is respect for co-construction of knowledge. So this means this is the collaboration between academics and people whose knowledge is experiential, it's learned through doing it. So obviously, as I've just been talking about indigenous, that's, lots of knowledge keepers. Indigenous, well, they acquire their knowledge through learning, having it passed down from generation to generation, and through interacting, their experience in the real world. And the same thing goes for all kinds of people who live and work, in the outside of the university, which is in fact almost everybody. So if we're going to move towards knowledge democracy, that we need to move into a world where we respect and trust, the epistemic differences between the way that university people work, their idea of knowledge, and the way in which knowledge is constructed in other parts of the world. So if another principle is that if we're going to do co-construction of knowledge, then we've got to go beyond the academic. We have sort of two big bags in the academy. We've got a quantitative bag of tools, and we've got a qualitative bag of tools. And we kind of mix and match, in terms of, how most academics put their work together. But if you're working in community, then you need, for example, to recognize ceremony, as a way in which knowledge is created. You need to think about how dance might be a way in which knowledge is created. You may need to think about how theater may be a piece of, or poetry, and all of these kinds of things. So we can use the arts, and we can use these kinds of collective social ways of constructing knowledge as, within our work as scholars, in addition to whatever traditional approaches we find useful. Fourthly, we believe that I don't need to most academics. I mean, we know that. That most academics do a study, write an article or two. If they're lucky, they can get into a book. They go to a conference. That's it. Then they move on to the next project. Most academics, and you can build a perfectly good career, a brilliant career, by never actually going beyond the academic mode of production. But if you're really interested in knowledge as a contributor to transformation, to social justice, and all of that, then you have to think about, while you're doing your work, you're working with people outside of the academy, you have to think about how your work is going to actually contribute to those people who are helping develop the ideas. Which leads to, some people think, well, aren't you being a bit anti-intellectual? You're criticizing the academy. What's going on here? If you're so anti-intellectual, where is that going to take us? Well, isn't that just the roadway to populism? And no, what we say is that, in fact, knowledge, the understanding of knowledge and whose knowledge counts, how knowledge is constructed, how knowledge is used, has to be understood better, and it has to be seen as something at the heart of transformative action, not something to be put aside to deal with. So we're going to have our demonstration now, and then we'll come back and kind of study all of these issues. It has to be seen. We will have more effective, job action, more effective, demonstration. Activities if we put knowledge at the heart of this. And the last two are important. One, of course, is the recognizing, which we're doing a much better job these days. Recognizing the rights of indigenous communities and others to control access and possess their own knowledge. But we also need to think about and be open to the idea that knowledge that if we do produce articles or books or whatever, in a place like Canada, or a place like England, and create a book that sells for $100, we have to understand that nobody can, that most people can't afford a $100 book, and not even students, not even professors. Like that. So this is why this move, you hear more and more people, and Mark has been very good in his own book, really push the publishers to allow them to release it both in an online fashion and as well as a hard, for sale fashion. So free and open access to research funding. I think that's probably, yeah, that's it. That's enough. You're probably mostly going to sleep by now.